Welcome to the Theology Made podcast. I'm Jordan. Today, we're going to look at the man who discovered DNA before DNA. It's the mid-1800s in Brno, a small city in what is now the Czech Republic. Inside the quiet walls of an Augustinian monastery, the friar walks through the garden. His robes brush against rows of plants. He bends down, not to pray, but to pinch a pod from a pea plant. The garden is alive with the buzz of bees, the creak of wooden benches, and the rustle of leaves in the summer wind. But the friar is paying attention to something most of us would miss. The color of a flower, the smoothness or wrinkling of a pea. His name is Gregor Mendel. He will never travel the world, never deliver fiery lectures to packed halls, never have statues erected in his honor during his lifetime. But here, in this quiet garden, he's about to uncover a secret hidden in plain sight. Mendel discovered the basic laws of inheritance, the way traits pass from one generation to another. In other words, he found the key that unlocks modern genetics. Darwin may have given us evolution, but without Mendel, we wouldn't understand heredity. Without Mendel, we don't get DNA, we don't get the Human Genome Project, we don't get modern medicine as we know it. Here's the paradox. Mendel's discovery, the building blocks of biology, came not from a laboratory, or from a cloister, not from a skeptic, but from a friar who believed creation was ordered by the hand of God. And yet, no one listened. His research was published in 1866. It was thorough, brilliant, and honestly decades ahead of its time, and completely ignored. It would take more than 30 years after his death for the world to recognize what had happened in the monastery garden. So what do we do with a story like this? A story where the godfather of genetics wasn't a celebrity scientist, but a man who took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. A man who believed that tending a garden could be an act of both science and worship. If Charles Darwin was the celebrity scientist of the 19th century, Mendel was his opposite, the invisible one. Darwin's On the Origin of Species was published in 1859, and it spread like crazy. People argued about it in pubs, pulpits, and parliament. Darwin became a household name. He was praised and hated, but he was always in the discussion. Mendel, he published his findings 7 years later in 1866 in a small local journal called The Proceedings of the Natural History Society of Rennes. Hardly anyone subscribed. Hardly anyone read it. The most revolutionary insights in biology were buried in a publication that was gathering dust. So why was he ignored? Well, timing for one. Darwin's theory needed a mechanism of inheritance, but Darwin himself didn't know about Mendel. Mendel sent him a copy of his paper, but there's no evidence that Darwin even opened it. Maybe it sat on his desk, one more elephant among many. Maybe he just thought it was some fan mail. But then there was the problem of language. Mendel wrote in the technical vocabulary of mathematics. Ratios, probabilities, numbers, and biologists of his day weren't trained to think in that way. He didn't fit the categories they had, so they dismissed it as irrelevant. And the result is that Mendel lived and died in obscurity. His final years were spent as an abbot of the monastery, embroiled in bureaucratic disputes over taxes, church property, and not celebrated as a genius. He passed away in 1884, known as a faithful friar, but not as the father of genetics. And it's a reminder, isn't it, that truth doesn't always win the spotlight, that sometimes the most important insights go unrecognized for a generation or two. And it makes you wonder, how many ideas, how many acts of faithfulness, how many seeds planted in quiet corners of the world are just waiting for rediscovery? And in Mendel's case, that rediscovery would come in the year 1900, when 3 different scientists stumbled upon his forgotten paper at almost the same time. Suddenly, the monk who bred peas became the godfather of genetics. But before we get there, we need to pause, because the rediscovery only makes sense if we first understand where Mendel was doing his work and why. It wasn't a university laboratory. It wasn't a royal research institute. It was a monastery. If you picture the great laboratories of history, you might think of sleek steel benches, beakers bubbling with colored liquid, microscopes lined up under fluorescent lights, and if you're a millennial, you might have just pictured Bill Nye. But Mendel's laboratory, It was a monastery garden. The Augustinian Abbey of St. Thomas in Reno wasn't exactly a cutting-edge research center. It was a place of prayer and study. The friars rose early, prayed the hours, and lived within the rhythm of the church calendar. And from the outside, it looked like a world devoted only to the spiritual. And yet, it was precisely this environment that made his work possible. For one thing, monasteries valued learning, and the Augustinian order traced itself back to Augustine of Hippo, who taught that all truth is God's truth, and that the order we see in creation, it reflects the order of the Creator. That belief made the natural world not just interesting, but worth studying. And for another, monasteries were self-sustaining communities. They had gardens, fields, and animals. The friars were no strangers to agriculture. Mendel didn't have to beg for access to research material. He had pea plants in abundance right outside his door. But perhaps most importantly, monasteries gave space for slow, careful observation. Science in the modern world can be frantic. Deadlines, funding cycles, and competition for recognition. But Mendel's life was structured by bells, not by the race for tenure. He had time to plant, to wait, to crossbead, to count, again and again, season after season. It's almost poetic. A life ordered by prayer became the soil in which ordered patterns of creation were discovered. And here's the irony. Centuries of critics have painted monasteries as places where curiosity was stifled, where the church smothered science. But in Mendel's case, and in many others, the opposite was true. The monastery wasn't a cage. It was an incubator. Think about it. Newton worked at Cambridge, Darwin on his voyages with the Beagle, Einstein at the patent office. Mendel? He worked in a cloister. The monastery garden? Well, it belongs in the same map of scientific discovery as the Royal Society or the University of Cambridge. And that raises the question, what was it exactly that Mendel discovered in this unlikely lab? To really understand Mendel, you have to understand the Augustinian lens he inherited. Augustine of Hippo, the giant of early Christian thought, had taught centuries earlier that creation was not chaotic, but ordered. He spoke of the hidden seeds of potential that God placed in creation waiting to unfold according to his design. For Augustine, studying the natural world wasn't a distraction from theology. It was another way of tracing the mind of God. And the theological DNA, it ran deep in the Augustinian order. By the time Mendel entered the monastery in the 1840s, that vision was woven into his intellectual world. Creation reflects creator. Order reflects logos. Patterns in nature are not random quirks, but whispers of divine reason. So when Mendel looked at his pea plants, he wasn't just looking as a gardener or even a scientist. He was looking as a theologian of creation. If God is a God of order, then even something as humble as a pea pod might carry with it the fingerprint of divine logic. And notice how he studied them, not with frantic pace of a researcher chasing a grant, but with the patience of a monk shaped by prayer. He planted thousands of peas, year after year, meticulously counting wrinkled versus smooth, green versus yellow. He didn't just glance at the surface, he trusted that underneath there was structure. And that trust, that conviction, that order was really there, was a theological conviction. And it's here that Mendel's story forces us to rethink the narrative we've been handed, that science flourished when it finally broke free from religion. No, Mendel's science wasn't in spite of his faith. It was because of it. There's an almost liturgical rhythm to his experiments. Plant, water, observe, record, repeat. Like the Psalms, sung 7 times a day, Mendel's work carried the cadence of patient repetition. His faith trained him for science. And out of that repetition came something world-shaking. Patterns so simple that a schoolchild can draw them today with a pencil and paper. And yet so profound, they underpin the entire science of genetics. But before we get ahead of ourselves, we need to enter the garden with him. Not just to see the friar, but to see the peas. Step into the monastery garden with Mendel. Rows upon rows of pea plants line the soil. Green stalks reaching upward. Pods are swelling with potential. Now, to most of us, they're just vegetables. But to Mendel, they are the mysteries that are waiting to be unlocked. Why peas? Because they're ordinary, accessible, and most importantly, full of distinct, visible traits. Some peas are smooth, others wrinkled, Some are yellow, others are green. Flowers can be purple or white, and these clear binary differences made them the perfect canvas for Mendel's questions. And here's what he did. He began crossbreeding pea plants, carefully transferring pollen from one to another. And then he counted thousands of plants, thousands of peas, year after year. Each plant was labeled, each generation recorded. And as the numbers piled up, patterns began to emerge. Smooth peas didn't just appear randomly. They showed up in predictable ratios. The same with yellow and green. There was order beneath the chaos, mathematical order. Mendel began to see what no one else had seen before. Traits aren't blended like paint on a palette. They are inherited as discrete units, what he called factors, what we now call genes. And the ratios, they were astonishingly consistent. You cross a pure smooth with a pure wrinkled, and the first generation always came out smooth. But breed that generation together and suddenly wrinkled returned about 1 in 4. But it always seemed to be 1 in 4. It was like listening to music and suddenly hearing the underlying rhythm. The surface looked random, but underneath there was a beat, steady and reliable. And from this, he articulated the basic laws of inheritance. Traits are passed down as distinct units. Some traits dominate over others. These units separated and recombine in predictable ways. He had cracked the code of heredity, decades before we even knew DNA existed. But here's the tragedy. Mendel presented his findings, carefully written out in his paper, complete with mathematical tables. He stood before his peers and shared what he had seen, and instead of amazement, he met confusion. The biologists of his day weren't ready for numbers. They thought in terms of fluids and essence, not probabilities. His insight was almost too simple, too clean to be believed. So his paper was filed away, his name forgotten, and the garden went quiet. But here's where the story tilts towards theology again. Because Mendel's peas are not just a story of science. They're a parable. The kingdom of God, Jesus once said, is like a seed, small, unnoticed, buried in the soil. You don't see it at first, you don't understand it, but give it time, and it grows into something that changes everything. Mendel's peas were that seed. When he finished his years of painstaking experiments, he must have thought he had stumbled onto something monumental. Imagine him carefully preparing his paper, rehearsing his presentation, walking into the room of fellow naturalists with a spark of excitement. And then silence. Blank stares, maybe polite nods, maybe confusion, but no breakthrough moment, no flood of recognition. His words fell like seeds on rocky soil. And it's tempting to think of this as a failure. But Scripture teaches us that some of the most important truths arrive in hiddenness. Jesus compared the kingdom of God to a mustard seed. So small, it seems insignificant. He compared it to yeast, buried in flour, invisible until it changes everything. The prophet Zechariah warned against despising the day of small things. And Paul reminded the Corinthians that God often chooses what is hidden, weak, and overlooked to shame the wise. Mendel's peas, they fit right into that narrative. His discovery was buried in an obscure journal ignored for decades. It looked like nothing, and yet it held the potential to transform the way humanity understood life itself. And there's a theological comfort here, because many of us, we can feel like Mendel at times, faithful in small, unseen corners of the world with little recognition to show for it. We pray, we teach, we parent, we serve, we love, and it feels like no one notices. But hiddenness is not failure. It's often the place where God does his deepest work. Mendel spent years bent over plants no one cared about, counting peas one by one. He died without acclaim, and yet his work became the foundation for modern genetics. And it makes you wonder, what hidden work is God doing through you? What seeds are you planting that may not sprout until long after you're gone? His story is a reminder that obscurity does not erase significance. In fact, sometimes God hides his greatest truths in the smallest, most ordinary places, like a friar in a garden. And just as Jesus promised, what is hidden will one day be revealed. For Mendel, that revelation came in 1900, long after his death. 3 scientists working in different countries rediscovered his paper and suddenly realized they were holding the key to heredity. The friar became the father of genetics. It's the year 1900. Europe is buzzing with new scientific questions. Darwin's theory of evolution has been stirring debate for over 40 years, but a nagging problem remains. How are traits passed down? If life evolves, what's the mechanism? And no one had a good answer. Enter three scientists: Hugo de Vries in the Netherlands, Karl Cornens in Germany, and Erich von Schemach in Austria. Working independently, each one begins experimenting with plants, and each one, to their astonishment, stumbles across the same mathematical patterns Mendel had discovered decades earlier. One by one, they realize, we're not the first to see this. They dig through old journals, dusty shelves, forgotten publications, and there it is. The 1866 paper by Mendel, tucked away in the Proceedings of the Natural History Society of Brünn. The friar had already done the work. He had already mapped the laws of inheritance. They weren't making a new discovery. They were rediscovering his. Almost overnight, Mendel went from obscurity to celebrity. The man who died as a humble abbot, embroiled in tax disputes and pastoral duties, was after death crowned the father of genetics. His name was now attached to the laws that govern heredity. Mendel's laws. And there's an irony there. During his lifetime, his work was dismissed, but once rediscovered, it was indispensable. Today, high school biology students around the world draw Punnett squares and calculate ratios without realizing they're echoing the work of a 19th century friar in a monastery garden. And in a way, this rediscovery tells us something about vocation and legacy. Mendel never lived to see his influence. He planted seeds, tended them faithfully, recorded his results, and died in relative obscurity. The harvest came later in a generation he never met. That's not just science. That's a parable of the Christian life. Now, we've all heard the stories before. Science and religion are enemies. Faith belongs in churches. Science belongs in the laboratories. And history is supposedly one long battle between the two. Galileo silenced. Darwin attacked. Religion holding back progress until science finally breaks free. But the story of Mendel tells us something very different. Here was a friar, a man of prayer, whose life was shaped by liturgy and the theology of Augustine. It doesn't get much more religious than that. And it was precisely in that setting, a monastery garden, that he discovered the laws of heredity. Not despite his faith, but because of it. The rhythms of prayer taught him patience. The Augustinian conviction that creation was ordered gave him confidence to search for patterns. The monastery gave him stability, land, and time to do his research. In other words, Mendel's faith didn't suffocate his science. It sustained it. And he isn't an outlier. Throughout history, the line between science and faith has been more blurred than the myth suggests. Many of the pioneers of modern science were people of faith. Kepler, who said he was thinking God's thoughts after him. Newton, who wrote more on theology than on physics. Faraday, a devout Christian who helped pioneer electromagnetism. Mendel belongs in that lineage. The godfather of genetics was also a man who chanted psalms, celebrated the sacraments, and believed the world was full of divine rationality, just waiting to be uncovered. Thanks for listening to Theology Made. If this episode helped you think a little deeper, go ahead and hit like or follow on whatever platform you're on, and maybe share it with a friend who'd enjoy the conversation too.